This session will have a multidisciplinary focus, and we will move through the different areas of drug development, starting from discovery and going through issues regarding reimbursement. And finally, we'll be discussing key regulatory considerations. So, for today, let me introduce your team. This is your team who will give a short introduction and will then allow you to ask questions. Steve, the spoon is yours.
I have the wooden spoon, which I've had many times in my life, but there we go. So yeah, good morning, everybody. It is a real pleasure to be here. It's the first time I've been to this meeting, and I hugely enjoyed the morning session. So I say, my name is Steve Rees. I work at AstraZeneca, where I lead a department called Discovery Biology, which is involved right at the start of the drug discovery process. The work that we do is to identify new drug targets. We try to create screening assays so that we can actually find molecules that intervene at those targets, and we help to progress them to the clinic. The work that my scientists do is at best 4 or 5 years away from a clinical trial, many years away from seeing a patient. But I absolutely recognise a lot of what I've heard this morning, and that we genuinely do work in an age of absolutely transformative innovation. The technologies, the skills that my scientists are using today in many cases just simply did not exist 5 years ago. And these are technologies in terms of how we understand disease. We've heard about genomics, but the omics list goes on and on. Transcriptomics at the RNA, proteomics for protein, breathomics, what's in your breath. These technologies are here and now helping us to understand disease, and they're generating huge volumes of data. We spoke about data earlier on. I suspect AstraZeneca will generate more data this year than in the entire history of our company, and that will only increase year by year by year. So how we manage data is critical. I did, though, also want to touch on how we're working in terms of collaboration and how we're bringing our technologies and capabilities to bear in terms of collaboration and partnership to discover new medicines. No medicine was ever discovered by one scientist working in one laboratory, and that is increasingly true. All of our drug discovery projects involve collaboration with many laboratories, many academic partners, many industrial partners, biotech partners, government partners across the world. And just to give you a couple of examples of how we're trying to work in so-called open innovation, AstraZeneca has, since it's been in Cambridge, has adopted a policy of really making our research capabilities available to the field. And the same is true in many other pharma companies. We have a partnership with the P10 syndrome to identify a new medicine for Cowden syndrome, whereby the P10 syndrome is funding scientists in our laboratories to discover a new small molecule medicine that we can take to the clinic. We're making available our expertise, our compound collection, all of our infrastructure, all of our knowledge. They're funding the people to do the work. That will cost them, if we're successful, about $3 million to deliver a drug candidate. It's a lot of money, but it's not a huge amount of money. In another example, we're working with technology called CRISPR. We touched on gene therapies earlier on. We are hugely excited about the potential of CRISPR. 7 years ago, none of us had heard of CRISPR. Today, there are 3 clinical studies ongoing in Europe to treat rare diseases using CRISPR. One treatment in the eye and treatments for beta thalassemia and sickle cell disease. This is a transformative technology that could cure, and cure is the right word, cure many genetic diseases. But that medicine will only be delivered to the clinic through engagement with the patient advocacy groups, through engagement with the charities that sponsor this research. Because delivering medicines of this type alters the paradigm of medicine. It brings with it new risks, it alters the paradigm. And it's only by engaging with patients, only by engaging with the types of technologies and skills that we have to bear, that we can build this partnership that will allow us to deliver these new medicines.
You know, I'm a great fan of Steve Rees, so it's a hard act to follow. So thank you, Joanna, for inviting us, and thank you, Steve. So I work in Oxford, and I'm interested in trying to come up with completely new targets for drug discovery. So what I'll do is I'll share with you just sort of 3 things. Firstly, what our group does, why we're working with patient groups, and a specific example of working with a patient group in a pharma company, actually AstraZeneca. So what we do in Oxford is we're currently working with 9 large pharmaceutical companies. We're working with 7 different patient organizations. We have a lot of funding from various government charitable funds. And what we're trying to do is to come up with completely new targets for drug discovery. And what we do is, for those novel targets, we purify the human protein, we build assays, we work out the shape of it, we generate inhibitors, we generate antibodies. These are very high quality reagents, and they're high quality because we're working with these 9 large pharmaceutical companies. Now, what makes us unique is that these reagents, which are starting points for drug discovery, we give them away freely to anybody in academia, anybody in biotech, and anybody in pharma, because I believe that's the best thing we can do to accelerate science and therefore accelerate drug discovery. So currently we're collaborating with more than 300 academic labs all over the world. They take these inhibitors, they take these antibodies, they test them in various assays, various disease models, etc. And of course, academics, all they care about is publishing. So this is a way of crowdsourcing science. What we also do is that these novel tools, novel data, novel reagents, we release them to the world immediately. So we don't sit on them for 12 months while we're writing up our manuscript, because in those 12 months, people out there could be wasting their time and resource doing something that we've already done. So what we're trying to do is accelerate innovation, reduce duplication and wastage. Now, the example around why we're working with patient groups, the reason is that when we, for example, generate a molecule which, for example, we may think might be useful in Alzheimer's disease, well, I don't know who the best Alzheimer's labs are across the world, but these patient organizations do. So what we do is we give those tools to the Alzheimer's charity, and then they share them with their network across the world. So this is a way of trying to accelerate science. The second reason for working with patient groups is, as Steve knows, I'm not a fan of animal models. I do not believe animal models predict human disease, even for monogenic diseases. And so what I'm interested in doing is trying to access patient samples, cancer cells, immune cells from patients, and testing our molecules on those. I think that's a much better way to come up with new targets. So we're working with patient groups on that. Something that's not been mentioned today, I mean, we're all trying to make the drug discovery process faster and better. Implicit in that is we need to make it cheaper, because we need to generate more affordable medicines. And that's a big issue. We don't want a $2.125 million treatment like Novartis have just got for their gene therapy for SMA, etc. Now, the final example about how we're working with a patient group and pharma. So several years ago, we identified in Oxford a gene associated with a very rare disease, fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva. So Alex Bullock in our group, he worked out the structure of it. He generated a small molecule inhibitor. He showed that this actually worked in an animal model in Harvard. He then showed that AstraZeneca have a molecule in phase 2, phase 3, which happens to be a potent inhibitor of this particular kinase. He persuaded AstraZeneca to give us that molecule, and now he's just got funding to do a clinical trial. And the clinical trial is going to be done in London, Germany, and the Netherlands, etc. So I hope that just gives you a quick flavor of what we're doing and why we're doing it, and maybe what's a little bit different to what we're doing compared to most groups. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. So I'm Nick. I'm the father of 2 children with an ultra-rare disease called alkaptonuria, or AKU, or black bone disease. And so for me, the whole adventure started 18 years ago when my first son was born. And after he got a diagnosis, I can remember the consultant telling us that there's really nothing that can be done. There's potentially a drug that might get developed, but we don't have very high hopes, you know. But anyway, we ended up forming a patient group in 2003. And one of the key things that we did was actually the fundraising. You know, it's just the bread and butter of what you do as a patient group, because nobody wants to help an ultra-rare disease that affects 1 in 500,000. And we started very small. First of all, with fundraising £5,000 for the autopsy of a patient in 2005. And then after that, we fundraised for a cell model, then an animal model, then a natural history study, more and more, till eventually we raised overall 11 million to do a program called Develop a Cure, which was a series of phase 2 and phase 3 studies. So we kind of built on it all along. And the key aspect for us there was collaboration. Everyone talks about collaboration, but it is absolutely crucial. We chose, rather than spreading our resources, to work with a single group a bunch of scientists based in Liverpool, particularly one called Professor Ranganath, who's turned out to be an absolute hero for this, and without him we would be nowhere. And basically every time, I'm not a scientist, I would go and see him and say, right, okay, we've done the natural history study, what do we do next? He says, well, now we need an animal model. He had it all planned out in his head, and we got the results of our 4-year study in July, 2 months ago, and it was successful, statistically significant, which means we can now go and file for the European Medicines Agency. Now 15 years ago I wouldn't really have thought that was possible. And then the third thing that we did as a patient group was actually identify and recruit patients. We knew of 4 patients at the beginning. 2 of them were my kids. One of them was the founder of the AKU Society, a man called Bob Gregory, and the other one was his sister. And we raised some funds. We did an identification campaign in 2007 where we sent out a mailing to every single GP in the UK and managed to identify around 60 patients. We now know of 90. We've now set up patient groups all around Europe, in Brazil, in India, in Jordan, in the US and Canada, and they are all themselves identifying and recruiting patients. And without that, we'd have never been able to do our clinical trial.
Just one comment, coming from a clinical background, I think this is a great example about setting clinical strategy where in order to succeed, one must have the rare disease, the disease of unmet medical need, plausible hypothesis, some biomarkers, and of course looking for a treatment effect. So now we can hear from our operations.
Yes. Oops, thank you. Well, I'm Thomas from Orphan Reach, and I present today, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm presenting the contract research industry, and I just have the opportunity now, I thought, to shed a little bit of light, put this a little bit into context also for you who don't really know what this is all about. I mean, the contract research organizations, they are, well, I would say working a little bit in the background, almost like ghost writers, because they are not visible usually. They, of course, don't own the IP. They don't have the funding. They are a pure service provider, like our organization as well. So, and that, of course, is important if you see the size of the market. We're looking at a projected market volume of $44 billion for 2021. So that is quite considerable. And 60% of that potential market for CROs is actually today already outsourced. So why is this important? It's important because, of course, a lot of these biotech companies, they only consist of a handful of people sometimes, very, very small teams. They, again, have the IP, the intellectual property, and they have the funding, but they heavily, almost completely rely on external organizations like a contract research organization to execute the clinical trial. So that is, of course, challenging because the CROs also, they have an additional challenge. They work not only in one therapeutic area, they work, of course, in multiple therapeutic areas. They work on many studies. They work for many different pharmaceutical and biotech companies. So there is a lot of complexity around that. On top of that, of course, you have then the individual patient level. Now, in the rare disease space, it is obviously important to make sure that patients are, first of all, not only identified, which is sometimes already difficult enough. Once you have the patient on board, you want to make sure that they also stay on board. You don't want to really lose them. So, so that is a challenge. You know, fortunately, I'm in the position. I'm the CEO of a contract research organization that is purely focused in rare diseases. So our teams are trained to actually deal with each individual trial on a completely tailor-made basis. So what we do is basically we almost build the trial around the patient. I mean, in terms of patient collaboration, of course, we look for input of the patients into the design of the clinical trial. I mean, the protocol design, that it runs well, that, for example, there are not too many blood draws. These are the normal things to look at, but also how then the trial is implemented. How is it realistically feasible? What we also look for is to support the patients during the clinical trial in terms of travel support. Sometimes home visits make sense to just make it smoother for the patients and their family. But lastly, I wanted to point out that what we feel is always so important, and I think that is reflected in many discussions that I've followed myself, is that the patient is really informed at all stages, even in the clinical development stage, which sometimes is a little bit kept a secret at times, but there should be newsletters produced. Sometimes even I hear complaints that the patients don't even see the data once they have completed the trial. So to keep the patient informed, I think that should be on the priority list, also for a contract research organization like ours.
So I'm Neal, I'm the General Manager of Sobi, which stands for Swedish Orphan Biovitrum, responsible for Northern Europe. And I think probably because I'm responsible for the commercial results, there was some oohing and ahhing in the audience before when people talked about pharma being the problem. So bear with me, but I believe we're a really important part of the solution. So in terms of the pharmaceutical industry, I think it's really important to get over today the scale of the investment that's taking place across the industry. We invest £4.3 billion every year into research and development, 24,000 people employed, and we export 45 million packs of products into the EU, which actually is very important as far as Brexit's concerned. And there's two estimates that now exist in terms of the cost of bringing a product to market, which is one of the reasons why people often talk about the expensive medicines. The first cost, the biggest cost, which has been used for years by pharmaceuticals ever since it came out 2012, 2013, is at $2.3 billion or £2 billion. That's how much it costs to bring a product to market. And the reason it costs so much is because so many products failed in the early stages or even towards the late stages of development. But that's been challenged quite recently, last year, and a study came out suggesting it was more around the 500 million mark to bring one drug to market. But you can see, even if it's only £500 million, it's a huge amount of investment to bring one product to market. So when we talk about pharmaceutical pricing, we have to consider numerous factors, and you can read the sort of four main ones there. But in addition to that, we also have to deal with an initiative to make sure that the growth of the medicines bill never becomes too much for the government to be able to afford, particularly as we get to an increasing population and also an increasing elderly population. So the voluntary scheme for branded pricing and access, so called VPAS, which replaces the previous scheme, which some of you may know as a PPRS, that limits medicine growth to not more than 2% every year for 5 years. So if the medicines bill, branded medicines bill, if it grows more than 2%, all of that extra money goes back to the government. And I think last year alone, I think it was £1 billion that was contributed back to the government from the pharmaceutical industry. So in no way am I saying we're perfect. And yes, we have a lot of things to improve. But actually, there's a huge cost to try and bring products to market. So, next slide. There's two methods. When the chaps on my left do all the clever things and finally get research and get the product, then we have to try and get the product reimbursed so that patients can access. Because as Alistair said, there's absolutely no point in the best pharmaceutical product in the world being on the shelf and not being with patients. So without going into too much detail, there are two processes that we have for medicines reimbursement in England through NICE. And the first one, the standard technology appraisal, was first came up about 15, 20 years ago. And they take a QALY, which is a quality adjusted life year. So how much of 1 year of high quality of life, how much is that actually worth as far as a pharmaceutical product is concerned? And if as a company you can get a QALY of about £20,000 to £30,000, you tend to get approval within the STA process. However, the STA process has not changed since 1999. So the actual value that the NHS is willing to pay for has actually declined in real terms every year since 1999. I think it will go down to about minus 40% in 2023. So that's a big issue. The other issue is a lot of the products designed for the STA are products where you will have huge amounts of clinical trial information from large populations. And of course, when we're talking about rare disease, the one thing you don't tend to have with each rare disease is large numbers of population for clinical trial data. So recognizing that, we found a new process called the HST, the Highly Specialized Technology Process. Why do we need a better way forward? We need a better way forward because compared to Germany and France, which are two similar countries in terms of population size, similar in terms of economy, there are about half the medicines approved for rare disease in the UK than there are in Germany, and considerably less than there are in France. So clearly, we need a better way forward. The challenges of the HST process, there are a number of criteria, 7, and they're very, very subjective in a certain way, and it's very difficult to get a product accepted within the HST process. And if you're not accepted within the HST process, the only process left for you is automatically into the STA process, which again then, because you don't have the patient numbers to actually have enough clinical trial data, it's very, very difficult to justify the reimbursement for the medicine. The reason to have hope for the future, 4 things. First of all, the quality is higher in the HST process. So clearly government and the NHS realise that we have to be able to provide more funding for more specialist treatments. There is a review ongoing through the APPG for rare medicines and the APPG for access to medicine, which is encouraging that better treatments for rare disease may be funded better in the future. And considerably more engagement through patient groups. And more so now, the government is listening. And the government realises that rare disease has to be taken seriously. And a lot of that is down to a lot of the people in here, people like Alistair with Genetic Alliance, making sure the government listens. And I think it's absolutely fantastic that Baroness Blackwood is coming this afternoon, because that really recognises that there's a stronger voice that needs to be heard. So keep talking, and I will stop talking and go.
I'm the last with the spoon, so I don't have a particular funny anecdote, except to say that we've kind of heard about positioning where you should come and talk to people, and I think the regulators are one that you really should come and talk to as early as you possibly can. So if you're a patient group or industry, I think it's really important. So I'm Dan O'Connell, I work at the MHRA, and my interactions with patients really started when I joined COMP, which is the Orphan Committee at the European Medicines Agency. And I was immediately impressed by the fact that our deputy chair was a patient representative, and we have a number of other representatives on our COMP. And also other EMEA committees are increasingly using patients. We've got the Patient and Consumer Working Party, which is a dedicated working party of the EMEA. And I'd also argue in terms of innovation that regulatory science also needs to be innovative. We've got a number of examples where we look at expedited approval. So, for example, through the European Medicines Agency, we have PRIME, which is Priority Medicines Review. And in the 2-year report, 30 out of the 36 products that were given PRIME designation, they were actually in rare diseases. So you can really see the impact of rare diseases. And PRIME is about trying to accelerate the drug development process, and scientific advice is really important. And what we see is that patients coming to the Scientific Advice Working Party of the EMEA, they're increasing in numbers, so we're seeing patients engaging both with industry and regulators at the same time in scientific advice. Nationally, we have the UK Early Access to Medicine Scheme, which is an important scheme to offer access in areas of unmet medical need for patients. And we've seen an example of a patient group at the MHRA, the UK Medicines Authority, where a patient group in Duchenne's came to really help advise us regulators about unmet medical need and position a product in terms of the needs of patients. We're seeing a lot of talk about of real-world data, and the EMEA has a registry project, and I think that would be really interesting to follow and see what the outcome is from that registry project and how regulators can better use real-world data. And finally, I'll just touch on 2 initiatives that I think are really trailblazing, or will trailblaze, hopefully, the interaction of patients in drug development. One is the IMI project called IMI Paradigm, which I think will really produce a really great set of standards and framework for engagement of all stakeholders in drug development for patients. And the other one is just a plug for the MHRA, that we have a patient registry looking at, so we have a patient public consultation out. So it closes on October the 7th, and really we would love your feedback on our consultation to know how we can better engage with patients. Thanks.
first question, how can we create incentive to collaboration between companies and patient groups? Should this be mandatory for drug approval? Anybody on the panel would like to start with question number one?
Well, I'm not convinced we need incentive, to be honest. I mean, sort of, I've worked in the pharma industry. I believe people working in the pharma industry, they absolutely are committed to trying to come up with new medicines for patients. I believe patient groups are absolutely committed to coming up with new treatments for patients. I believe many of my academic colleagues, likewise, they're committed to coming up with new drugs for patients. I said earlier, I mean, we're currently working with 9 pharma companies. We're working with 7 patient groups, more than 300 academic labs. We're just trying to do the best science to make this process better and cheaper and faster. I gave an example of where AstraZeneca have got a phase 2, phase 3 asset, and they were good enough to give us that molecule to take into a clinical study in a rare disease cohort. I genuinely am very optimistic about the future. I just think that I think we've all got the same goal. I think this is a team sport. I think it's just about creating win-wins. And I think the other thing that I would say is that I think we need critical mass. What we don't want is 7,000 patient groups going off and almost duplicating technologies and stuff like this. It would be great if we could bring some of these, create clusters of patient groups, maybe focused on a particular platform, gene therapy or RNA therapy or whatever, and then sort of really try and accelerate this. Because, I worry daily about the cost of medicines. If and when we come up with a new drug for a common disease like Alzheimer's, my worry is it'll bankrupt the NHS overnight. Here we're talking about 7,000 rare diseases. We need to make the process cheaper and faster.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think it's certainly true looking back 10 years when Chaz and I were both in Glaxo GSK, it was very difficult to collaborate with pharma, and pharma wasn't particularly outward looking. I think that paradigm has changed dramatically over the last decade or so. And certainly speaking from AstraZeneca's perspective, the type of partnership that Chaz alluded to runs through our Open Innovation Initiative. We call it Open Innovation. We have about 200 projects running through that Open Innovation Initiative. And all of those projects are aimed at working with external partners to develop medicines that are based on the science of that partner. And many of those are in rare diseases. And just to pick on a very specific example, just a week ago Tuesday, we had a meeting with a research charity. I won't mention who it is, because I'm not sure if it's supposed to be confidential, but the principle's the important thing. We had a meeting with a research strategy whereby we're trying to develop a new medicine for a rare disease. That partnership will be structured such that we at AstraZeneca do what we're good at, which means we'll find a molecule. We use all of our technologies to find a molecule. The foundation will provide access to the animal models, such as they are, the cell models, to allow us to characterize those molecules as they move forward to the clinic, because we don't have those. We don't have the expertise to create those. But equally importantly, they'll then provide access to the patient population, such that when hopefully we reach a clinical study, we have a path forward into the clinic. That's the type of model that we need to adopt going forward. And we've spoken a lot about the cost of drugs, whether it costs 500 million, 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion. Read the literature and choose your number. It's a huge amount of money. But what I would suggest is that developing a drug for a rare disease will cost massively less than the billions that we're talking about here. 95% of the cost of developing a medicine is incurred through the clinical study, the clinical research plan. For a rare disease with a well-defined patient population, that cost drops dramatically. I don't know what it would cost to develop a medicine for many of the diseases we've spoken about today, but I know it's not going to be in the billions, probably in the tens of millions.
Yeah, just wanted to add, I think it's a resource issue fundamentally for patient groups. There is a huge imbalance in resources between industry and patient groups. As patient groups, one of the reasons we set up Find a Cure, for instance, was to train patient groups in all the different aspects of drug development and all that, so that they could actually speak on an equal level to industry. But the problem that you have is that most patient groups are supported by volunteers, and a lot of those volunteers are looking after family members who are ill, So there's a real resource issue. And I think if we could actually, rather than making it mandatory or whatever, develop some kind of funding mechanism that would really support the growth of patient groups, I think that would make a major difference.
Can I just touch on the mandatory, because this has come up quite a lot recently, and it says it relates mandatory to kind of approval. And this was raised at a meeting sort of last week that I was at, and sort of someone asked, oh, should we mandate patient engagement? And you've highlighted really nicely that there are some funding and resource challenges to be able to do that. But another person said, well, actually, it's obvious we should be asking the patient. So why do we have to mandate something that's obvious? And I think there's a danger if we mandate something, it will become more of a tick box kind of exercise, as opposed to really added approach to proper PE in drug development.
Thank you, Dan. So I guess we have actually partly answered the question number 2. So perhaps we skip to question number 3. Do companies approach patient groups, or should it work really the other way around? I'm wondering, is there somebody in the audience who's asked the question who would like to identify yourself and to have a dialogue with us? If not, perhaps I put this question to Neal.
I think you should approach us, but I also think it works both ways, and I think it's a really important part of the process. And the people that we've met from our company's perspective who've approached us have always been so passionate, so committed, so innovative that it's actually impossible to say no most of the time. But you shouldn't be embarrassed. You shouldn't be worried about asking pharmaceutical companies for help. If we can help, normally 99 times out of 100 we will. And normally the one time we can't help is because there's some kind of regulation or control that just makes it very, very difficult for us to do that at that time. And that's to do with legislation in terms of, you know, the way that you can commercialise pharmaceutical products. But absolutely.
Chas.
Can I just make a general comment? I mean, I've occasionally heard people say, oh, pharma is the problem, or the regulators are the problem, or the commercial guys are the problem. I genuinely think all the stakeholders are trying to do the best they can. And I think if we start with that sort of critical narrative, that's not good for building a win-win collaboration. I think Steve said that, you know, in his organization, when they set up these collaborations, they focus on their strengths. And I think what we all have to do is we have to focus on our strengths. I believe pharma has strengths. I believe certain things are easier to do in an academic setting. I believe patient groups have a strength. I believe the regulators do, etc. So we've just got to come together and work as one. And if we do that, then it'll be a lot faster and better and cheaper, etc. And I would also say, I mean, sort of, I've heard people criticize the pharmaceutical industry, but you imagine Steve is CEO of AstraZeneca, and that will happen one day, I hope. But you know, the thing is, everybody's expecting Steve to come up with a new drug for Alzheimer's, for mental health, for cancer, for diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and 7,000 rare diseases. Even AstraZeneca doesn't have the resources to do all of that. And so, you know, I think we just need to recognize it. I think actually in this space, I think we do need more public funding, and I think we do need more philanthropic funding.
So your answer, Chas, leads really nicely to the next question, which really asks, can we eradicate pharma as the panto villain and rewrite the collaboration story?
Can we eradicate pharma as the panto villain? Big, bad pharma. Well, we hear it all the time. You hear it in the, you know, it's implicit on the news, it's implicit in the newspapers, it's implicit all over the place. And I think we in pharma, actually everybody involved in biomedical research, has an obligation to begin to address this story of big bad pharma. Pharma makes a profit, it exploits patients. Well, pharma does make a profit. Pharma makes a profit to reinvest in the discovery of the next generation of medicines. It makes a profit which goes into the pension funds that almost everybody in this room will have. You know, it's a feature of the society in which we work. Where I think pharma itself, and certainly as a scientist working in pharma, we have arguably failed in terms of advocating for what we do, is we simply haven't advocated for what we do. The benefits that pharma has brought to society, the benefits that medicine's discovery have brought to society, are immense. And you only have to look back at the medicines that have been delivered over the last 50, 60 years to look at that. And Crestor is a good example, and our CEO, Pascal Soirée, talks about Crestor. And I think it's very interesting the way he phrases it. So Crestor, transformative medicine in terms of lipid lowering and the effect on heart attacks. AstraZeneca developed Crestor. Crestor was marketed for 15 or so years. It generated however many billion of sales. That medicine is free to all of society for the rest of time. Now that statement is absolutely true. That medicine, every medicine that is being developed today will be free for the rest of society as of about 15 years' time when those patents expire. And we need to begin to tell the story about the good that pharma can do, because pharma has only done good, in my view.
And I would back Steve. I mean, like I said, I spent 2 decades in the industry, and I've been a decade now in Oxford. And I do believe it's only pharma that can do these really large, multinational clinical trials, especially in some of these complex chronic diseases, which require maybe 5,000 patients. They take 2 years to do and maybe cost £500 million. There is no way most biotechs will ever do that, or academic groups certainly not. So I think we absolutely need pharma.
Yeah, I think the reality is much more mixed, to be perfectly honest.
Yes.
I think from my personal experience of working with pharma, we have had some brilliant collaborations, such as with Neal and with Sobi in Sweden. Without them, we'd have never done our clinical studies. They've been absolutely fantastic. But we've had interactions with other pharma groups where, to be perfectly honest, we've been treated pretty badly, you know? And it's not great, you know? It's like like there was one I remember we applied, it was a number of years ago, for £8,000 to do a patient workshop. And we had to jump through all these hoops and fill in forms and phone calls and all that kind of stuff. At the end, we got £500. It was like, what was the point in all of that, you know? So I think people need to see a bit how they do their interactions. But I also think we need probably a third way, you know? And by that, what I mean is that, yes, I understand how the pharma industry works. There's venture capitalists, there's private equity. They look at their returns. They look, should I invest in that sector or that sector? They all want the highest returns. But there's a growing breed of what people call social investors. And this is halfway between philanthropy and kind of traditional venture capital. And I think that is what is potentially needed for the really difficult, ultra-rare diseases which otherwise would not get finance. In our situation of alkaptonuria, if we really managed to get the funding because of the European Commission. If we had to do it now because of Brexit, we'd be really stuffed, and there is nowhere to go to get that level of funding. So I think we need some kind of growth of this social investment in rare diseases, because it's been in other sectors, but we need it here.
Mm-hmm. So do you have an idea how we could perhaps go about it?
Well, yes, actually. I was just discussing, there's a number of things. One of them is there is a group called the European Venture Philanthropy Association, who meet every year. And one of the things would be actually speaking to them to get social investors on board. The other thing, which I'm thinking about for some time, it would be really nice to actually set up an independent foundation that would be funded by a small percentage of the profit from industry, say 0.1%, 0.5%, whatever. That goes into this independent foundation with an independent board that patient groups can then apply to for research and for all their work. And that way, pharma cannot be accused of actually trying to influence the patient sector, because it's all done independently, but that would free up resources, and that would make the difference in power balance much more equal.
Okay. So,
Can I just say, I mean, I have to say, I mean, comments like power balance I don't think are particularly helpful. And I appreciate you've had difficulties working with some companies, but frankly, if you went and tried to set up collaborations with 50 academics, some of them would be good and some of them would be bad. So I really think we need to help each other and not criticize each other. I genuinely think we've all got constraints, and I appreciate we need more funding. We absolutely need greater urgency, but we have to absolutely reduce the cost of this process and make it faster. So I'm with you on that, and I'm absolutely with you on the social front.
So Neal, before I get to you, I just would like to ask the audience whether there are any reactions or additional questions on the points raised by the panel.
With adult onset conditions, very often the people running the patient groups are experiencing the conditions day in and day out. So I'm symptomatic at the moment, fairly low symptoms, I have to say. And I'm fortunate in that. I know some of my group members are really struggling at the moment. So yes, we're pushed. We're really stretched. We are not funded. I'm doing this off a legacy from my dad, who was a doctor. I can't think of a better way to spend it, but that means eventually I will run out of money. So, and the tech fixes for the condition I've got are relatively inexpensive, and we can't access them because of the reimbursement process. I've contacted so many people. They're all really helpful, but much like my early consultations, I'm left with more questions than answers. It feels like another diagnostic odyssey, and I don't really need to go through that again. So from my perspective, it's the lack of something like a social fund would be perfect for us, because we don't need to deal with pharma at all, unless there's a philanthropic arm that says, yes, we'll do some tech stuff as well with you, because there isn't going to be one drug that's going to help with this. There are some that can help moderate, modify symptoms. So for me, whenever I hear about drug repurposing, I think it's terribly exciting, it's hugely important, and new drug development. But the technical fixes seem to be kind of left out of the equation, and the adult onset conditions are often left out of the equation.
Thank you.
So I just maybe a couple of points, because I think Nick said something which was really interesting about that idea of the board, but just in terms of pharma. So I joined the pharmaceutical industry in 1994, told my mum, very excited about my first job. She's very proud of me. And then she said, "You're not going to sell thalidomide, are you?" And I said, "No." And I think that also sets a scene in terms of pharma. So pharma has done some bad things in the past. And, we're involved in haemophilia and the contaminated blood scandal. And Sobi wasn't involved with that, but companies were. And so you have to recognise that some people will always have a negative perception of what pharmaceutical companies do sometimes, because sometimes in the past they have acted inappropriately. And I think what you're seeing in the last 10 years, 15 years, is new CEOs coming through, younger CEOs, with more of a view to change the world to a better place rather than how much money can we make. And I think that's being more and more recognised. I think it's very exciting. You've got a really interesting opportunity this afternoon. Baroness Blackwood, she works very closely, obviously, with Matt Hancock. The VPAS that I mentioned before, that will produce billions of revenue for the government over the next 5 years in terms of what pharmaceutical companies pay back in. And if you could persuade people like Alistair to go back to Genetic Alliance and lobby Genetic Alliance, and you've got a lot of power in this room. A small percentage of the VPAS, and no one in the industry knows what it does. It's supposed to be for the NHS, but it goes back into the government. A small percentage of that for rare disease would be extremely valuable for patient groups and might help Nick's idea get more momentum. So maybe someone can propose that question to Baroness Blackwood. A small percentage of VPAS for rare disease patient groups would be a massive boost for everybody.
All right for that.
Are there any questions from the audience? Here.
I benefited from this drug myself. I'm not going to name names, but if you in the pharma industry want to know what I'm talking about, I have a genuine question as a patient who benefited from this drug. It's a drug that was developed by the pathology department up at Addenbrooke's. The license changed to another pharmaceutical company who's not in the room. They're American, I don't even know who it is. But what I don't understand from a patient point of view is when that drug was made in Cambridge, it was £750 per treatment infusion. Then when it's brought out and the license is transferred to somebody else, the drug changes its name, it then gets bumped up to £60,000. The NHS cannot afford that. As a patient, it feels really bad that that amount of drug, when you need it 3 times, is being spent on you. I don't understand how the price can go from £750 to £60,000.
It shouldn't. It's a loophole which some pharmaceutical companies exploit. And I think the only thing you can do in that circumstance is, pressure on the government, pressure on your MP. MPs, from my experience today, are more and more likely to get involved if you ask them to than they were perhaps 20 years ago. And, it's interesting, I'm sure people will talk about this over lunch. Small majority, weak government, in fact, no majority, weak government, really actually good to get people to support you on things. Because when it's a strong majority, they tend to only support the things that they want. When they haven't got a majority, they are more likely to support things if they think people are then going to vote for them. So things like that absolutely shouldn't happen, and that's why Nick's absolutely right. We have, you know, and Steve, and we have to do more so people see the positives the industry can do. And that's an example of why we have a big job, because sometimes companies act in an inappropriate fashion.
I mean, this drug, me included, is literally life-changing. One of my friends has had it, and before she was 30, she was housebound. Now she's got her career back and everything, but it's a lot of money for, you know, one patient.
The government have to.
Yeah.
The government have to stop those loopholes.
And I completely agree. I mean, it absolutely shouldn't happen. I mean, we read about this in the papers many times a year, of cheap drugs suddenly becomes a hugely expensive drug. I don't think you would find a company like AstraZeneca or GSK or Pfizer or Novartis or any of the big pharmaceutical companies engaging in that type of practice. Where it happens, it tends to be much smaller organisations. Almost certainly, I mean, Chaz, your thoughts, almost certainly organisations that do not have their own in-house research component. What they're doing is they're buying medicines that are currently in the marketplace and they're hiking up the practices hugely. That is not something that I would believe that you would find any pharmaceutical company that has an in-house research component actively doing. It's a loophole and it should be stopped.
I completely sympathise, but my earlier comment around cost was, and I gave the example of Novartis, so you're probably aware Novartis a few months ago had a gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy approved, and they are charging, and it's one infusion, $2.125 million. Now, there's no way anybody in the UK can afford that. Only a few people in the US can afford it. Now, I think Novartis is a brilliantly innovative company. It is a gene therapy, it's a single infusion. And of course, you know, if you're a patient or a carer of that patient, that child's going to die by the time they're 2. And if this allows them to live to 5, hopefully 10, maybe longer, then it's awesome. But my comment is that we are moving into new modalities. They're not just small molecules, gene therapy, etc., etc. We need to work together to drive down those costs so that it doesn't cost that much. And we need to increase the probability of success in the clinic, you know, because somebody said earlier, a lot of the pharma costs are paying for the failures. So we need to increase the success rate, and we need to drive down the cost of this process by at least tenfold, hopefully 100-fold.
Thank you. I think with 5 minutes to go, we just have time for... Oh, unfortunately, we're over time, and I guess I guess we don't want to stand between you and lunch. So thank you very much, and thank you for your questions.